Namaste. Welcome to Our Planet in Perspective. In today's episode, we will be in conversation with climate activists from around the globe. Our guests for today's episode are Dr. Ranjan Datta. He is a Canada Research Chair, Tier 2 in Community Disaster Research at Indigenous Studies, Department of Humanities, Mount Royal University, Alberta, Canada. Dr. Kamrul Hossain. He is a research professor and director of the Northern Institute for Environmental and Minority Law at the Arctic Center. Suprita Suman. She is an expert on climate change and geopolitics as concerns their polar issues and their legal and political dimensions. Kanavagalli Suryanarayanan. She is an advocate and polar law expert from India. Dr. Margot Hurlbert. She is a professor and Canada Research Chair in Climate Change, Energy, and Sustainability Policy.
You've been working on participatory governance mechanisms for zero emissions by 2050.
Yes.
How does that play a significant role to climate change?
In Canada, and especially where I'm from, we're very much an oil and gas province or jurisdiction in Canada. So setting the bar, not just at reducing emissions, but actually reducing emissions to zero or net zero, so that we're not expending any emissions in our activities, our mining, our lifestyles, is an important goal for Canada. So it's one that I have been researching for about 6 years now, and it's really exciting. I can't say it's because of me, but to see the discourse change. So 6 years ago when I talked about net zero, very few people had heard about it, and now Canada is actually passing an act to achieve net zero by 2035. Wow. So it's really exciting to be at the forefront of that idea and thinking about how we actually do that.
You've also led a special report for the IPCC. Could you tell us something more about that?
Yes, probably one of the best points in my career was leading the chapter on risk and decision making on land and climate. So I really learned a lot about the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, which is the group of scientists, social scientists and natural physical scientists that get together and write reports for the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And that's where we make the developed countries the agreements to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So it was an extreme honor to work on land because I'm so interested in land and water and our relationships with land and water, how we're going to adapt and how we're going to mitigate, and to lead this core group of researchers that are from various disciplines to write this chapter. The IPCC, many in Canada, and I can't speak for Asia, but think the IPCC is very radical and very advanced. Their science is pushing the limits, but I can assure you that the IPCC is very conservative. So when we're writing the reports, it has to be published literature. So something that's already been researched and published, so it's probably 4 years old. So it's already something that I call stale, old. And then it goes through an approval process by governments. And the governments will take issue with anything that's moving too much of an agenda. So it's actually very, very conservative in its findings and its warnings. If anything, the academics and the academic literature, listening to them outside of the IPCC would be a really good idea.
How difficult do you think it is for a world that's functioning entirely on fossil fuel energy to shift to the alternative sources of energy that are climate friendly?
So in the IPCC, there's socioeconomic pathways. There's different ways to achieve net zero. It's not just one. We talk a lot about technology, and I talk myself a lot about power production, energy technologies that will get us to net zero, because we cannot burn fossil fuels. We just cannot do it unless we're going to do very expensive and somewhat questionable technologies that are really not proven, like geoengineering, if you've heard about creating something that mimics a volcano. These are really outlandish solutions, but there are in industry and oil and gas some solutions like carbon capture and sequestration, like putting greenhouse gases back into the geological formation of the earth that we've been doing for 40 years. So there are certain things that we can do. We need to move to electric vehicles, and we need our electricity to be generated by clean and renewable sources.
How do you think we can find a balance between our Western knowledge and Indigenous knowledge? Is there a way to bring them together and take them forward?
I truly believe that there is, and I truly believe that diversity is so important, but by diversity We need to realize that individual people are diverse and special and not balance them as equal or subservient or rank them or compare them in any way. That we really need to give Indigenous people and local knowledge-based people their time to share their knowledge and share it with other people. But having said that, we need natural and physical science. We know the climate is changing, and Indigenous people know it's changing, and it's not something within their lived memory. So we all have to work together as scientists and knowledge keepers in solving this dilemma. We call it the Anthropocene, which means humans are changing the world in a manner that's never happened before. So we really need to roll our sleeves up together in order to solve this.
And humans need to change the world for the better and not the worse.
Correct. And that's where the social science, but the Indigenous relations and knowledges about caring and caring for Mother Earth are so important for us to be hearing at this point.
You deal with Indigenous people, human rights, and climate and disaster. And it's often so that the ones that contribute the least to climate change are the ones that are most affected. For example, the Indigenous community is highly affected. So why do you think are the reason that we're not able to prioritize them when it comes to climate change?
It's all about how Indigenous people, local people, and land-based people see the land as their relationship, land as their body, land as their family member and God. On the other hand, the new liberal system or outsider, they see land as a profit. Once you don't understand that we have obligation to the land, all the exploitation comes up. So the current education system even in Indigenous community, they are learning colonial education. The reason I'm saying colonial, because they do not know or they do not get opportunity to learn their land-based language, land-based spirituality as important as the Western or outside education. So they learn something is different, which is not applicable for their land. So once they get education, they are no more able to cultivate their land in traditional way. In Bangladesh case, many situations, Indigenous people, those who have been sustainable for 100 years, they end up with the garments work. Its maximum job, the 14 hours payment may be $1 or $1.5, and we are seeing is a development.
As per your research and your expertise in this area, what do you think are some of the policies or strategies that government in different nations can adopt to secure these indigenous knowledge or traditional practices?
In Canada, there is a, it's called Truth and Reconciliation Call for Action, 94 Call for Action. And within 94 Call for Action, they clearly outline what they want, how they want. As a settler color immigrant, I have responsibility to learn. As a researcher, I have a responsibility to implement the 94 Call for Action. In Bangladesh, when I'm thinking as a Bangladesh, we have a responsibility to learn what community wants. We have responsibility to protect the indigenous language. We have responsibility to protect the land-based spirituality because it has been very sustainable ways of doing it. So when we are thinking the how to policy change, the community know what is the best for them. And we as a researcher or policy maker, we have many opportunity to learn and also make meaningful implication for the community. And it's going to benefit all. It's not going to benefit only Indigenous people. If we can protect the water, land, we are going to benefit all of us. It's going to benefit all of us, not only Indigenous people. That's why when we are talking about land and water, our climate crisis is all of our responsibility. And we cannot separate climate crisis from the land rights. We cannot separate Indigenous language right from the climate crisis solution. All are interconnected. But solution has to come from the community.
The community people know it the best.
Community knows what is the best for them. They are not saying I know what is the best for all over Bangladesh or Indigenous people, one Indigenous community in Canada. They are not saying I know what is the best for all. They know what is the best for their own community. They know what is the best for their own generation, their future generation. That's why we need to transform the policy, education, research in a way community can be benefited. And once community can be benefited, we as a researcher or policy maker, we all get benefit from it.
When we talk about international environmental laws, what do you think are the gaps that you can see?
It is a very dynamic field. There are new situations emerging every time, so you have to address those situations. Shipping, for example, is one of the things that is emerging in the Arctic. So the gap was that there were no concrete regulations focusing the Arctic concerning shipping. But in 2007, Polar Code was adopted, and Polar Code was specifically applicable to the ice-covered waters. So that applies to Arctic, and that is about regulating not only the pollution control issues, discharge, for example, from the vessels, and also it's about operation of shipping and what kind of ships, for example, ice class vessels. So what kind of vessels you need for the Arctic. So that problem, for example, addressed by Polar Code, but then again heavy fuel was not kind of regulated by Polar Code. That means that is a gap there. So that brings more greenhouse gas emissions, and that is problematic for the Arctic, because that Arctic is melting faster, and global change or environment temperature rise in the Arctic is said that 4 times faster than the global average.
Your field of expertise also focuses on human rights law. So can you tell us something about the situation of human rights law when it comes to the indigenous people living in the Arctic region?
Human rights law evolved actually after the creation of the United Nations. First, actually, Human Rights Institute is called Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It was adopted in 1948. Thereafter, there were, but this declaration is not binding. It's kind of, it has a normative significance. But this declaration did not talk about indigenous people. There was no reference to indigenous people. Then there were negotiations going on, and 1996 there were 2 international legally binding covenants, or legally binding law, international law was adopted in regard to human rights law, which are called International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights and International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. None of the convention referred to indigenous people. So indigenous people's rights were not included within the mainstream human rights law. This is called mainstream human rights law, or this is called actually International Bill of Human Rights, where Universal Declaration of Human Rights and with 2 covenants I referred to. But then there was an article in International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Article 27. It says that in those countries where ethnic minorities are living, then states have the obligation to protect their culture, their language, and their belief system, religious activities and that kind of things. In most of the countries where indigenous people are living, they are minorities. So this article is applied for indigenous people when we talk about indigenous people's human rights. These articles are interpreted to protect indigenous people's rights. But problem is that indigenous peoples vary wide, because their rights are rights in terms of culture. I mean, indigenous people's rights in terms of culture is very wide. So what does culture mean? I mean, what elements are included within the culture? So you need interpretation. Then there are human rights monitoring bodies within these conventions or covenants. So human rights monitoring body interpreted that indigenous people's rights are covered by, for example, Article 27 of the ICCP, or International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And by culture, it means that it has a broad meaning, that fishing, hunting, other traditional form of activities, reindeer herding, for example, for Arctic indigenous people like in the Nordic countries, caribou herding in Canadian Arctic indigenous people, even fishing on the ice, frozen ice in the sea. These are part of their culture, and this culture has to be protected. So these are the issues that we address when we talk about indigenous people's human rights in Arctic, but that applies also in other regions of the countries. For example, in third pole region, Himalayan region, yak herding could be considered as culture of indigenous people. So if there are intervention, they could seek protection from the regulation that we have in place. But there are other legal instruments also that apply to indigenous peoples. For example, ILO Convention 169, which gives protection and which is the only legally binding convention or legally binding instrument that applies to indigenous people. Unfortunately, the ratification history is very poor in that convention. Most of the countries did not, where indigenous people are living, did not ratify this convention. Only 23 countries so far ratified this convention. In most of those countries, indigenous people are majority, they are not minority. But then UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which was adopted in 2007, was a groundbreaking development. Again, it is a declaration, it's not legally binding, but it gives normative significance to protect indigenous people's rights. For example, there are provisions in the declarations. In many places it says that the free, prior and informed consent of indigenous people should be adopted, or should be kind of contingent in regard to the development or whatever activities that are of indigenous people's concern on their land, on their territories. And this principle or this norm endorsed in the declaration does not give any legally binding force, but on the other hand, national courts like in Peru or in other South American countries, in their judicial institutions, they were including or they were referring to these provisions, so giving binding force of the provisions even though they are not legally binding.
Your work focuses on geopolitical and legal issues regarding climate change. Can you tell us something more about your work in the polar region?
Polar regions are losing their cryosphere very fast. They are warming more faster than other regions of anywhere in the world. United States Geological Survey is a survey, it is USGS. 2007, it reported that Arctic North Pole is seabed is rich in hydrocarbon resources for energy security. Every country was looking towards the Arctic, where we can invest, we can extract, and we can find some global common area where we can drill for hydrocarbon. Here the legal question arises, because everybody want a factual claim in the Arctic. The Arctic littoral nation, they have their continental shelves there, their exclusive economic zone there, whereas the rest of the world wanted to find where is the global common heritage of mankind, that is high sea is there. So Article 76, it has given the right that littoral state can submit its claim for extended continental shelf by proving that okay, I have my depositions there, sedimentations of the rivers, they have been deposited in this region, so I have my claim. So every Arctic nation, all Arctic 5, Canada, Russia, America, Norway, and by virtue of Greenland, Denmark also. So all have, they started their extended continental claims, and all the claims overlap. They are now conflicting and disputing. That is why the legal question emerged here. Within this legal question, technical advancement played another, it has intervened the matter actually. It has facilitated all which was a fable story before 2000. Now people can drill, they can mine, ice shelves are not so hard, drilling is now feasible. We can extract the resources at lower cost. So whatever the climatologists were thinking, for them it was a major concern. Ice is melting, the global climate is on the, means it is alarming. But for global commerce, it was an opportunity. They were looking towards, okay, if there is any opportunity, sometimes energy security. Another, Arctic fishing. Arctic fishes are very nutritious, freshwater fishes. The world was looking, okay, fresh fishes, crabs, everything, golden crabs, silver crabs are there. Everybody was looking, every actor was looking for a piece in the Arctic. How? They were looking just towards the United Nations Convention on Law of Sea, whether I can have a factual claim or not.
The concept of blue economy has gained popularity in the recent years. How does it contribute to blue justice?
Blue economy, everything you are doing with the oceans, whether it is offshore mine drilling or it is oil exploration, ocean tourism, fishing, or you are doing any commerce through the navigational straits of the ocean, these all are blue economy. South Pole is also resources, but really for extracting the South Pole polar resources, you need the special type of ships, like having the ice cutters. And when United Nations has adopted this agenda, Sustainable Development 2030, then this concept came 14, the goal 14, that's life under the water. So this has developed the concept of blue justice. Means blue justice is related at the countries who are very poor or landlocked nation which don't have the continental shelf in the oceans. So these countries must have a fair share in the whatever the resources being extracted from the ocean area. So it is something to maintain an equitable distribution of the marine resources. This is the blue just.
Could you tell us about the amount of damage that the developing countries and the developed countries have been doing, and how polar law can help us address these challenges?
This is overall in terms of it's happening across the world, but the problems are not recent. This has been in the past. So because of industrialization, because of colonization and raw materials being exported from here, we were exploitative colonies. So the raw materials went from here, and then the industrialization happened in the global north. So that does have an impact, a long-term impact. And now the developing worlds are also, we are also moving ahead with times. We need to have a very sustainable view about the future. We need to have a holistic approach. We need to go back to our roots, is what I feel. As a civilization, we all at least in the Indian subcontinent, we all have been more preserving nature, worshipping nature, at least in the Himalayas. The mountains are prayed, the rivers are prayed. Every confluence we have temples. I mean, it's across the region. So it's important not just for the science, but also to take in the cultural aspect, the spiritual aspect, to bring it to the local level. Not just science and policy can make a difference. It is the people who have to make the difference.
Right.
So that's where I feel that we have to involve people, and we need to look at our roots. Science is not something very Western. Science has been part of our lifestyle. It's been, I don't know about here, but at least in my part of the world, we pray to the rivers. We say morning, we say our small slokas, like Gange cha Yamune cha Godavari Saraswati. We say those slokas in the morning. It's inherent in our culture. Somewhere we need to understand that, bring back, it's not something alien, somebody else can do for it. It's not just the state, not just the policymakers, not just the scientists. It's the people who have to, bring in that difference. And even in India, we are talking about mission life. The government of India is talking about mission life, and the G20 is ongoing now. So we want to make those changes, sustainable changes at our homes. I'm wearing a patola sari. It is a handover from my mom. It's not a fast fashion. So we are all looking at, these are handlooms. We need to go back to our roots. We just cannot keep on industrializing. We cannot keep on building, constructing. We need to make these changes at a very, very, basic level. The communities have to take, the village councils have to take responsibility. So these are all important aspects.
How inclusive is polar law when it comes to indigenous people?
See, there's a subtle difference there. The Arctic is, there are many states which are settler colonies. We are post-colonial countries here. The settler, which means settler colonies means the Western countries still hold on to their lands. The indigenous people are given almost an equal platform in the Arctic Council. Their voice is very much heard, and they take part in all cooperation mechanism and the Arctic Council working groups, all projects they take forward. So their voice is very much heard. But of course, when there are state-centric issues like what happens now, sometimes their voice, I feel, is muted. When larger issues, when states decide the future, their voice is a bit muted, is what is my feeling about the Arctic. Otherwise, they have a very large space today to communicate, to voice out their messages. There are 6, indigenous people, permanent participants in Arctic Council. So they make a lot of difference, and practically you cannot move anything in the Arctic Council without hearing them. So the states have to hear them.
Right.
So even though in theory it is different, practically they do hear the indigenous communities. But what is the difference is that they are very small communities in, for example, in Greenland, around 54,000 people live. They're small communities. One small settlement will have around 300 people. 200 people, so very, very small communities. But in our case, our knowledge system is very vast, very, very vast. It is up to us how we want to utilize it for our benefit. And unless we don't start engaging with the system that is outside the Western science, we're going to lose it. We're really going to lose on it. This knowledge is going to fade away. So we need to engage those people. We need to, look at the land. We need to be connected to the land.
We will be back next week with a new episode. Until then, hope you have a great week ahead. Namaste.